Andy, you said something interesting there when you were alluding to the youth ministry. You could have continued or looked at a different way of doing it, but then you picked up on this multi-site rather than moving off to something else. Were you thinking senior pastor or just I want to do the next type of ministry?
Yeah, honestly, we weren't thinking senior pastor. We were thinking this is what God's calling us to do next, and that's what we're going to do. And I can't really say that if in Stacy and I we were ever saying, boy, one day I think we'd like to be senior pastors at Crossroads Fellowship. Not that we wouldn't. It just we're very much this is what God's calling us to do now. And so let's do the best we can do with what God's called us to do now and just take it one step at a time. And so for us, multi-site was the next thing, and let's just invest into it. And we've always been the people that say, hey, if God opens a door, then he opens the door and we'll check into it. But in the meantime, we're just going to keep doing this. So no, there was no, hey, this is the next step, and now the next step after this is senior pastor. I
want to emphasize, I think what you're saying there is pretty important. And it kind of goes back to something you said earlier. This is my home church. So while I work here, if I didn't work here, I care about it. Mm-hmm. And so you're not sort of the journeyman, like I got to do this and I got to do that. There are some climbers in ministry. It's not a happy thing. And some of us have been that way. I was that way until I got hit with a 2x4 and realized that's not the way to lead. Some people mentored me out of it. And you've gotten to that point too. And I think that's an important lesson to be where you are. I remember one of the hardest rebukes I ever got was my first mentor said, you're always thinking about the future and you're not paying attention to where you are. Mm-hmm. And when he wrote that in a letter, I was so mad because it was so true. But it was the best thing that changed the trajectory of my thinking about ministry. And I'm really glad that you already have figured that out and lived that. I know it's unique to your story and ours, but it happened that you had to take on this multi-site. Our first one, it blew up bigger than any of us thought. Now we're in this other building. Well, we didn't plan that as senior pastor training. How do you think maybe it did help prepare from youth ministry moving in, and then now when Chuck was feeling that you might be the guy, we're going to come back to that.
Right.
What was going on there?
Yeah, I think when you do multi-site, there are a lot of different ways to do multi-site. When we first started ours 5.5 years ago, there were really several different models, and every church did it their own way. And so I think partially the way that we launched the multi-site campus is that we launched our first campus as a full campus, meaning we had Sunday morning things happening for adults and teenagers and students. We had small groups. We had Sunday morning worship. We were meeting in a school, so we didn't have the midweek things. But everything on Sunday morning in small groups really was launched as a full campus. And I think that, let me just say this too, because this is real important, that the way that pastors on a staff honor their senior pastor, I think is huge. I think that's massively important.
Indeed.
That we honor our senior pastor, we honor our elders. And so we didn't go into it thinking, oh great, now we can just go do whatever we wanted to do. There's a trust that happens. And one of the first conversations that Chuck had with me about multi-site and senior pastoring is, I need to be able to trust you. And he did, and I'm glad he did, and I have to be able to trust him, and I do. So not only in the transition between associate senior pastor to senior pastor, but also from youth pastor to multi-site, is that
making any kind of significant transition that affects your life in the church, there's got to be some trust that we're finding God's will, and you're an agent of it, I'm an agent of the elders. But that's that whole trust community that believes God will tell us, but it may not just come to me only. And it's confirmed in the community.
And we moved about 12 miles away. So now we were entrusted with myself and the small core team that went and started it, that we've now got to take the DNA of Crossroads with us and transplant that. And even though it's going to look different because it's in a school and our setup is different, our style might be a little different because of just the people we have to work with, the overall DNA of who Crossroads is important to keep the same. So to answer your question about the process of preparing to be a senior pastor, I think that's a huge part of it, is that I had to be able to keep that DNA of Crossroads, of the history of Crossroads, who we are, our mission, vision, and values, and bring that with me and then pour that into people. So
I see what you're saying. I mean, it's just like you would do that in a regular senior pastor transition. How do we keep what we should, even while we might be planning a new future?
Yeah.
You were doing a new future, but keeping an old DNA.
Right. And here's the thing, too. Being a senior pastor is not just about preaching on Sunday mornings. I didn't preach at Wake Forest for the first, 2 years. I think we were doing kind of a video. And then we experimented different things and all of that. So the glamour for anybody that might want to be a senior pastor of, wow, I can't wait to preach on Sunday mornings, that's really not impressive. because it's all the stuff behind the scenes. It's the DNA, it's the vision, it's the leading the teams, it's being away from the main campus, so to speak, and leading the process. To me, that stuff equipped me more
It's
than being
seeing the
a
church
pastor.
beyond the 11 o'clock gathering. I mean, that's the easy part of seeing church,
Right.
but you're talking about seeing the church when it's all week long out there and all its multitude of relationships.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
So,
interjecting leadership into that part of church life.
yeah. So I think that prepped me for a potential senior pastor more than, being able to speak and do those things and be part of the creative elements, which I love to do. It's really, you're literally running a church, and we started with just a handful, about 100 or so people. And this past Sunday, as of when this is recorded, there were about 1,200 up there. And so that's a big growth in 5 years. And we got to basically manage it. I'll use the word manage. It's more of managing.
Not a bad word.
Yeah, it's managing it and learning how to manage the team and managing budget and managing process and systems and all the things that we have really helped me, I think, more than anything else.
Andy just used an interesting word when he talked about our DNA, and we all know what DNA is in a medical sense. It's sort of the non-negotiable things within any organization that makes it what it is. And so once a church or an organization or ministry is defined, how does it continue to multiply? It's going to make what it is. And so messing with the DNA is not is important. It's important to get it right. And Chuck and I were part of probably the formation of the DNA at Crossroads. I think it's fair. Maybe you could just address what our DNA is, because you summarize it as well as anybody, and why you want that to continue even as it became a multi-site, as it goes to another generation of leadership. Talk about our DNA and your concerns to make sure that we don't lose what we were founded for.
Yeah, Doug. The DNA at Crossroads, simply put, we say we want to develop fully devoted followers of Christ who want to transform the triangle in the world. That's it. The way we do that is we help them connect, grow, serve, pray, and give. We call that the 5 actions of discipleship. That's what we've distilled out of the scripture in terms of what's the church about in terms of helping its people become like Jesus. So as people do that, the DNA is carried forth. Now, we articulate that through our mission, our vision, our values, our strategies. All of those things are geared to help carry out that DNA, that mission, vision, perspective.
Let me jump in here, because Chuck and I have been together for 25 years. We remember how our DNA was mercurial, I would say, for the first few years. You can't be a church plant and not be a little bit loosey-goosey. Yeah. So we did that, and I wonder if you could, for people who are listening, you and I both have come up in churches, and it's great to help churches rethink their DNA. We had a chance to kind of create a new, what do you recall of that early season, maybe the first 7-8 years, when we were sort of solidifying, not this, not that, but this? Because you do have to make choices. We can't be everything. We're not Anglican, we're not Catholic, but we are purpose-driven around this for a reason. Talk about that, because some of our audience might be in a church thinking, oh, you're Crossroads, you got it made. But you can't affect DNA. We made hard choices, and then we had to live long enough for the DNA to settle into the organism.
What I would call what you just described is ministry puberty. I mean, you think of a teenager or a preteen, they're trying to figure out who they are. And there's things driving them and impulses, and all the friends are speaking into their life saying, you should do this, you should do this. That's kind of what it was like. Everybody had ideas. But ultimately, God has to speak, and every human's designed by God. They're eventually going to become what God created them to be, and so ultimately, Crossroads, we had to get comfortable with the reality that I think every church has to get comfortable with, and that is God will make you unique to focus on what we call our leading edge, but you can't ignore the rest of what it means to be a church. Yeah. And a lot of churches, especially startups, they start up because they're really good at one thing. And that's a great thing, and they pursue it. And it's really what I believe is it's their leading edge. It's the passion. It's the unique thing that God's called them to do in this city or to lead with. Problem is, some churches make the mistake of thinking that's all they ever need to do, and they hear things like, do one thing and do it really well, which is true. But with a church, you don't really have the option to do just one thing well. You can have a leading edge, but you still have to take care of cradle to grave. You still have to marry and bury and disciple, and so our leading edge is evangelism. And we're always going to be out reaching the city and evangelizing the lost, and that's our passion. That's the thing we lead with, but we don't ignore the other things that come out of that. Just getting people saved is only the first step, and so that makes it harder. It's a little more complicated. But But
Because we're talking about allocating resources, people, money, space, programs to marry, bury, baptize, disciple, do mission, not just evangelism. And there's some tension, healthy tension in that.
correct, and the tension is good, and I think it's from God, and you can't run as fast as when you're just doing one thing. There's this balance between, there are times where I feel like we push harder on the leading edge because God's saying run, and we'll run for a while. But after a while, then you get all these little babies, and you can't move it so fast because they can't move that quickly. So you slow down a little bit, let them grow, let them catch up, get your stuff reorganized, fix your systems, and then God will say, okay, run again, and we run again. And learning how to let the Spirit lead that, I think, is very important, and being comfortable with that. That's what I appreciate about Andy. He definitely has a heart for evangelism and outreach. It's what drives him. It's why one of the reasons I knew he was the guy.
Yeah, you were going to say earlier about you kind of knew Andy was a guy, and I think organizations make mistakes sometimes thinking, well, we've had an evangelist, let's just go find us a sweet old guy. And I mean, the reality is Crossroads is bigger than any of us. But we often have to personify what Crossroads is meant to be in the larger family of God. And so I think there's something wise there. You're saying you realize this guy had the right temperament, gifting. It could have been someone else, but he happened to have. That was important, and you're acknowledging that.
Yeah, in fact, I'll tell you why I thought he was the right guy. It's real easy. First, leadership. I mean, from the start of the multi-site to eventually taking over as senior pastor, we're a large and now complex organism and organization. The church has grown. It takes leadership, and it's probably the primary thing. Not only the gifting of leadership and the skills of leadership, but a passion for leadership. Andy has that. He is a leader, and you can see it. You can tell. And from the very beginning, when he was just in the student ministry, he was just a natural leader, and I'm like, that guy's got potential. But he's also got the leadership qualities of being able to learn from others and realize the power of exponential leveraging great people around you. He's not intimidated by strong people around him. He wants strong people around him. In an organization like ours, especially as it keeps growing, you have to depend on other really good, capable people. You can't do everything by yourself. You just can't. And not if you want to succeed.
I want to camp out on that just a minute for our audience, because one of the things we teach in the transformational values is, are we building my kingdom or the other? And that's so simple, but that is a fog cutter. It's a line running down through Christian leadership and nonprofit or churches. Who's building what here? And when it's about me and mine, I don't want a guy that's as sharp as me. He might make me look bad. If I'm building the kingdom, it's like, finally, look, we got an all-star on our team. Praise God, we got another good guy to help us do the work of God. And we're kind of taking it for granted because that's our oxygen, but I know it's not always the case, but it can become the case. And we really want to be a church that models that and then helps export that, because it's a better way to do church, whatever size or whatever ministry.